The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Today's episode is Peacemaking in a Polarized World.
Welcome, everyone, to Created in the Image of God. I'm your host, Wade Franson, and in the studio with me, I have Najeeba Syeed. And we've just been talking about how our paths crossed without us even knowing it, which is not surprising given the work that she's doing and the long and winding road that I walked through, as some of my audience knows, in getting to the point where I'm really focused on the things that she has been focused on. So I'll just read a very quick couple of little significant vignettes from her bio, and then we'll introduce her to you. She is a peacemaker, healer, and scholar who has spent more than 2 decades at the intersection of conflict resolution, interfaith leadership, and social justice. She has a number of accolades and credentials. She's taught at several universities. What was of most interest to me was that she was on the board of something called the Western Center for Justice. I may have gotten the name slightly wrong, but we'll talk about it as we go through the show. Welcome to the studio, Najeeba.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. So many circumstances of the universe conspired to bring us together. So I'm glad to be spending this time with you in the audience.
Well, what's really amazing is that when I first reached out, or when the producer first reached out to you, it was because of your work, and there was no awareness of any specific connection. But we recently had somebody on the show who has his own podcast called When You Look, and it's all about coincidences, and it's all about bringing amazing stories and then asking the audience, do you think this was coincidence, or do you think there was a divine hand involved? You can choose either one, but for those who look, they see divine providence. So we always start by getting to know the real you, so that when we later hear about your work, we can put it into context. So tell us a little bit about your creation story, who your parents were, circumstances of your upbringing, and how those cultural forces and circumstances shaped you and might have led to the path that you're on.
You know, it's a really good question. I'm an immigrant, and these days, immigrants are in the news a lot. And my parents came here to pursue their education, and then also stayed, and I've been here since I was 3 years old in the United States and went through the naturalization process. And I think one of the important parts of that story is that for me, I grew up with the reality that I had adopted this country and this country had adopted me. And so there's always been a really clear sense that part of the mission of my work is having had the incredible sort of privilege to be able to be a part of a culture that wasn't one in which generations of my family had grown up in, this notion of connection, of constantly thinking about what does it mean to be a member of this society and this nation and active. My parents were very clear, especially from a very young age, that interfaith was a part of how we approach the world. So my parents moved to Southern Indiana. My dad did his degree at Indiana University. And, you know, people ask me, this is back in the late 1970s, early 80s. At that time, there weren't what we call halal meat stores or halal meat places. So my father was looking for a place to do halal meat. And we actually ended up, I had a Christian bus driver named Mrs. Anderson. So she somehow said she had a farm. I don't know even how the conversation in Bloomington, Indiana came up with a 5-year-old kid, but she said she had a farm, and my father was able to go to her farm and do the ritual similar to Jewish dietary law. Muslims have a form of ritual slaughter in which animals that we eat are blessed. And, you know, at that time you couldn't get that kind of meat in Southern Indiana. So I share that story because sometimes we think interfaith is so lofty, you're having deep conversations, and sometimes it just comes out of necessity in Southern Indiana in the late 70s and early 80s. And so that story to me indicates, which is a big feature of my work, neighborliness, that sometimes we meet each other's needs. Someone has a resource, you have a need, and you can connect and collaborate and meet that need. So that's kind of a story that illustrates for me how important and how real interfaith conversations are happening all over the country. They were happening in the late 1970s in Southern Indiana, in a place that one might not have imagined that was where that journey would begin. So I feel like that story has been kind of important for me because it allows me to understand that the ways in which we think about diversity can be so vast, and then sometimes it can be so tiny. You know, a little Muslim girl getting on a school bus talking to a bus driver who's also a farmer. I feel like it's also a very Midwestern story as well of hospitality and care.
That's beautiful. I want to dig deeper into your background, but I want to just segue off on that for a moment, because here's another interesting coincidence, right? I was also born in another country, came here at age 2, was later naturalized, right? And the reason for me immigration is really front and center of my awareness is because through an unfortunate divorce situation, my father, who was a Swedish citizen, actually kidnapped myself and my 2 sisters from our mother, who was a Canadian citizen, while in America. My youngest sister had an expired American passport. We had Canadian, my father had Swedish. He managed to somehow smuggle us into Sweden, where this became a court case that eventually went to the Supreme Court of Sweden after 2.5 years of being separated from our mother. We were also separated from each other and my father for 2 years. While all of this was grinding its way through the courts and my father had returned to the US to fight the legal battle, he was authorized to do so because the Swedish courts awarded him custody. And the point I want to make here is my younger sister was actually undocumented because she didn't have a valid document, right? So all the permutations of this, most people don't understand the difficulties and the challenges. And your story is a heartwarming example of something immediate that we can all grasp onto, which are cultural differences, because we also kept some of the Jewish food laws, not kosher, but we had to look at labels, and we couldn't use gelatin because it had, we couldn't have Jello because it had gelatin in it, which was usually made from pigs, not cows. And, so I grew up with that awareness. And it's very awesome that you met a family who, and it comes from the kids, right? Because you had that 5-year-old child, is probably the connection through the children is what made that possible.
Yeah, and I think one of the pieces around the religious diversity of the U.S. is the history of migration and the ways that we tell the story of the country. And for me, one of the things my father always said when I was growing up, part of my formation was, Najeeba, the United States is a country that's welcoming to people of all religions, and that's one of the reasons we came here. And he was really careful to make sure that we connected, for instance, to the history of Black Muslims in the United States, who we now know probably 1/3 to more of individuals who were enslaved and brought to the United States were Muslim in their origin. We know that, for instance, there were scholars that were brought that were writing on the slave ships in Arabic. There were enslaved people that were able to teach and engage in religious activity. And so what he would kind of tell us is to connect to those spiritual histories, to understand that the United States, in the very formation of its nationhood and prior to the formation of its nationhood, he did something really interesting when I was growing up. He said, I want you to read this book about Native American religions. And I'm at that age, it was about 9 or 10. And he said, I want you to write down similarities and differences between Native American practice. I don't remember which tribal community it was, and Islam. And we talked about things like, for instance, the word Great Spirit means God. And in Islam, the way we think about Allah or God is not as much, it's not anthropomorphized. We don't have a vision of God as an individual, as a human, but the way that it's that Allah or God is described in the Quran. So it's so interesting to think back, because he said, I want you to learn this because Native Americans are a part of this religious and cultural history. So he has this PhD in linguistics. So he was thinking, oh, a 9 or a 10-year-old will just do this. And the funny thing is I did. And
Of
now
course.
many years later, it has played a role. So I think the ways in which we connect to the history of this nation, and obviously, as I mentioned, to the land before it became a nation as we know it, that is a multi-religious, multi-spiritual, multi-racial, multi-ethnic history. And I mention all of that. Obviously, I'm a professor, so I'm going to probably do that. But for me, it was part of growing up. I was socialized that way to see this country as one of our biggest assets, was that we are open to everyone.
I'm going to share a couple of things here in a little bit, but I want to, so which country were your parents from? Which country were you born in?
So I was born in, my citizenship was India, and I was born in Kashmir. As people may or may not know, we border Tibet, Pakistan, and India. So it's a crossroads of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. So a lot of folks, when I want to do interfaith work, the assumption is always that Abrahamic Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, as people construe it in a lot of dialogic tables. And I'll often tell people, well, in Kashmir, if you go, there's a lot of cultural exchange. There was a time that Kashmir was host to a very deep Buddhist practice, a Buddhist ruler. Other times, obviously, we were engaged and involved and have a lot of Hindu holy places. And then Muslims have been also, at this time, in terms of numbers, a very large number. So for me, interfaith is also integrated into where I was born.
That's amazing. So then, as you began to become, an adult, as you began to take control of your personal journey, tell us a little bit about that coming of age portion of your life.
So I think there's another story, we have the story of a little brown girl in southern Indiana. And for me, I ended up moving to Northern Virginia, or the DC area, with my family, and went to high school there. And we did not journey back to Kashmir until I was in high school. Partly because my parents decided to have 6 children. And so taking 6 children back and forth on a graduate student salary was probably not realistic. What we ended up doing is going back to Kashmir. And for people who don't know, the line between India and Pakistan is one of the most highly militarized zones in the world, similar to North and South Korea. The military to civilian ratio is percentage of military presence of armies there of multiple of those 2 nations is very high along the border. And so for safety, we did go back, and I, coming as a young suburban child, born in Kashmir, but not having been back, I didn't really have memories. I grew up without extended family. By the age of 14, I think I had one cousin in the US. It was a very, in many ways, isolated. I had friends. I didn't grow up with grandparents. I didn't grow up with a large family. So we got to the airport in Srinagar, the capital of Kashmir, and we get out of the airplane. At that time, this was the 90s. You could have I think, no, it was actually the late 80s. You could go and have your whole family would be there waiting for you at the airport. So I remember, Wade, just getting off the airplane. I had only seen my parents and pictures. And back then we didn't have Zoom. We didn't have all the things that we have today. So a phone call would be, hello, what's happening? It would be very perfunctory, short, and, expensive to do international calls. So it was a lot harder to maintain relationships. We did write letters. And I just remember tears coming down my face because this was the first time at the age of 14, the summer after my freshman year of high school, that I saw people that looked like my parents. I'd seen pictures of them, but I was looking at an aunt and she looks just like my mom. And it seems like such a simple thing, but it gave me a sense of belonging that I didn't have because I didn't grow up around an extended family with cousins. And so it was really incredible. It just made me cry. And as I'm in the car and we're driving, the other thing I see along the road because of the security situation was every 50 feet, every 100 feet, there was an army soldier standing with a weapon, at that time, an automatic weapon. And it really hit me that here I am having this moment of deep connection, but I'm having it with a region or a part of the world in which people experience over the years multiple wars, multiple forms of violence. And as we do in those situations, and I think about this a lot, I talk to God, and I really was, I have this conversation with Allah, or God is, the Arabic word for God. And I just said, I want to make sure that I'm always an agent of peacemaking, and that for me, my Muslim faith is the foundation of that. And that's something that led me to end up choosing a Quaker college. So I ended up going to a Quaker college in North Carolina because I looked at different religious traditions. And at that time, we didn't really have Muslim colleges like we do now in the United States. And I thought, I want to go to a spiritual community where people are deeply engaged with religion and peacemaking. So that trajectory, that decision-making was influenced by a conversation with the divine, and it led me into the scholarship that has been really the North Star for the work that I do.
Well, thank you so much. There's so much there we could unpack. We're going to have to go to a commercial break. I'm just going to make one comment, which is for anyone who has never been to a Quaker service, the Friends Church, you need to do that. What is not well known is that the Quakers were instrumental in interracial, racial resolution, abolishing slavery in this country early on. One of the religions most focused on that. Is that fair?
Certainly. And they have also been at the forefront of a consistent voice for human rights and against violence in all forms, but particularly war. So I was really moved by that at the age of 14, and then ended up by 17 choosing a Quaker college over several others, which I won't mention, but it was a really important decision for me.
Wonderful. We're going to go to a quick commercial break, which will feature some of the work that Najeeba is doing. When we come back, we'll talk more about that work. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Najeeba Syeed on Created in the Image of God.
There's a question that I ask when I intervene in conflicts, and the question that I ask one party or one side about the other is, are you in each other's futures? I think the core of our work at the Interfaith Institute at Augsburg University is to build bridges. So I really think about what we're doing in this moment, whether it's on campus, whether it's in our community at the national, international level, as building a future in which all of us are in that picture.
I always think about this commitment to interfaith work in three categories. So on one hand, there's a deep commitment to helping people to understand other faith traditions. But second, there are relationships that have to be built. And then the third piece is always about attitude. You can have all the knowledge in the world, you can actually have relationships, but ultimately you got to change people's mind.
The Interfaith Institute is supporting faculty like myself on campus by helping develop workshops such as religious diversity and belonging in the classroom. The Interfaith Institute both models and teaches our students how to overcome that division and instead to think about our shared humanity.
The diversity that Augsburg offers was super important to me, mainly because I have this deep-seated want to know more. And I felt like in every community I'd been in before that, it was very much the same. Same values, same ideas about everything, and it's been like ingrained in me since I was born. Going to school here at Augsburg University, very diverse, and I immediately took so much interest in just how beautiful every different religion and culture was around me.
Being an interfaith scholar ultimately means that you're coming in from different viewpoints of the whole world, whether you're Muslim, Jewish, Christian, or atheist even. You kind of just all come together to have these very specific dialogues. Being on this campus in general has shaped me to be someone who listens a lot more than speaks, to understand people and where they're coming from.
And we're able to really model what it means to have a conversation while sometimes vehemently disagreeing on issues. And I think that's really the powerful component of what we do at Augsburg. We're coming together, not saying we're coming together because we all agree, but we're coming together because we believe that we occupy this planet, we share this neighborhood, we share this campus, and there has to be a space in which we can come together to address really dire issues of our time.
And so the work we're doing right here in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, for example, on harm reduction around the opioid crisis is a perfect example. Students who come from a Christian background, students from a Jewish background, our Muslim neighbors come together around the fact that this is having an impact right here, right where we are. And what can we do together to respond to that?
After college, I want to go into human resources, and that's all about people. Through interfaith work, I feel like I can really use that to be a good host and a good guest within my own workspace.
Focusing on the workplace is really important because it is one of the venues in our society where you can't duck away from diversity.
And I think the work we're doing in Interfaith right now is a movement that is very much alive on college campuses, but now spreading to other communities and organizations.
Well, welcome back to Created in the Image of God with Najeeba Syeed. Right before the break, we had learned about how she chose, with divine inspiration after her trip to Kashmir, to go to a Quaker university, and that led to her path. So tell us now a little bit about the work that you did through that university and beyond.
So while I was at the Quaker College, I was the only or the first Muslim that joined, and so I think they wrote an article, something like Islam comes to college in the form of Najeeba. And I told someone I would love one day to have a job where they don't write a press release of me being the first Muslim professor hired by a Christian institution, which has happened multiple times, or the first Muslim of this or that. So it'd be nice to just ease into a position where it wasn't the first, and one day we'll definitely get there. And I feel so honored to have been in those positions. So I think
you're a groundbreaker. There's no denying it. There's no getting away from it. You're a pioneer, and it's wonderful and needed.
And I feel honored and that I was in those positions. So I think one of the things I remember there's a beautiful story that made it into Diana Eck's book around her formative book around religious pluralism in the United States. My father apparently shared stories about my life with great scholars since he was also had his PhD. And so he shared this story that has ended up in that book. You can still find it to this day. For my first Ramadan, and this is timely, Muslims are going to be entering Ramadan in the next couple of days. And for my first Ramadan, there were no Muslims that I could fast with. So our campus minister, Quakers don't have clergy in the formal sense, our campus chaplain, he made sure that I had a group of Muslim students and friends to break my fast with. Sorry, the correction is they weren't Muslim. That's what's powerful about the story. And so here's a Quaker chaplain seeing a young Muslim girl at the age of 17 or 18. And for those who don't know, Ramadan is a very social gathering. It was the first time away from my family. It's 30 days long. And here I was on the first day, just really honestly forlorn, without family, without with other Muslims to celebrate on campus. And that act of pluralism, but not just pluralism, but that act of hospitality was something that stuck with me and has become part of the American canon on religious pluralism. And I think it's an important story because what it shows is a lot of times we focus on how do we be a good guest? Here he was being an incredible host and doing it for someone who wasn't just of his sort of a different religious background, but understanding what that ritual meant to them. And it wasn't just providing me dates to break my fast. It wasn't just making sure, for instance, now a lot of university cafeterias have availability of food, but it was saying, oh, she needs a group of people to do this at least with her on the first day. I remember, for those who don't know, fasting is sunrise to sunset. We eat before the sun rises, we break our fast, we don't even drink water. And I remember one of my friends tried it and passed out within a couple hours. So it was too much for him. But I had friends who tried to fast with me. So I share that story because I think it really influences what happened after I graduated from college. I went on to law school. I also, in between college and law school, focused and studied traditional Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic law as part of my inquiry into my own faith tradition. And I studied with a scholar that is well known in this area of what we call adab al-ikhtilaf, which is an Arabic saying of this Arabic terminology around the notion of ethics of disagreement. So how do we disagree with one another? And how do we disagree as scholars? And that one of the things he really taught me was that to disagree is one of the signs of God's divine plan for us to be different. That the Quran says we could have made you, in one verse, we could have, multiple times actually says we could have all been the same religion, the same race, the same culture, but our diversity is really an act of creation by God. It was God's will that you and I, Wade, are from different countries, that we have different skin tone, that we have different cultures, that we have different religions. What the Quran says is the challenge is ta'arafu, which means to know one another. So for me, my lifelong mission of work is, how do I get to know you? How do you get to know me? And it's been, I think, challenging sometimes. And it's also been a part of journey of how do I get to know myself? Because if I show up and I don't know what forms me, what my tradition is, what I'm connected to, then I can't really get to know you if I'm not able to speak about myself. So I think for me, the work that I've done around peace building is to understand that really the fear of the unknown is what causes us to resort to breaking away from one another, breaking the bonds of connection. So my work has really been, I would sort of summarize it with, how do we humanize one for the other? And thinking about the Jewish philosopher Levinas, this idea that encounter, the knowing one another, the best way it's done is face to face, exchanging expressions, getting to know one another. It seems like it's such a simple act, but it feels like such a radical act in our moment right now to say, Wade, I want to get to know you. I won't judge you. I don't have to accept your belief system. You don't need to accept mine, but I am curious about your journey. And that's why I'm so excited to have this conversation today.
Well, it's just wonderful, and I was actually moved to tears as you were describing the community of the college, rallying around, hey, we have this Muslim person, and we need to be with her on this journey and support, because I have a daughter who's a senior who's going to college next year, and it just feeling how you were embraced in that moment, and how everyone that participated in that would have gotten so much out of it, even if they were passing out, right? So, the person who tried to do the fast. And plus, fasting is common in all religions. Every religion has some form of a fast, but they're different. The Jews fast differently. They have Yom Kippur, which is one day, 24 hours without food and water. And that's how I fasted as a Christian. We used to fast that way. And then Christians tend to have Lent. And then as a Baha'i, today we have something that's kind of similar to Ramadan, but at a different time of the year, 19 days of that same kind of fasting, with the night and daytime. Very similar. But when you mentioned face to face, I thought this is the time to bring in this program, Facets of One, right? Because if you think of a diamond with multiple facets, a facet is like one face, one of many faces of a diamond. And throughout human history, God has done exactly what you said the Quran makes specific. He has created diversity. Let's talk for one moment about the title of the show, Created in the Image of God. Where is that drawn from? It's drawn from the story in Genesis where it says that God created us in his image, male and female created he them. And then it says, these two shall become one flesh. And then it says Adam knew his wife and they bore a son. But there are all these jokes about how who can understand a woman as a man, who can understand a woman, right? Even the way that God created us in the male and female form causes that desire to understand a different facet, a different perspective. And one more comment I want to make about Genesis is God reveals himself in two very different ways in the first two chapters of Genesis. First, you have this omniscient, unknowable God existing outside of time and space, who with a word creates time and space, right? Let there be light. Let there be lights in the heaven, the greater and lesser light, to rule the day and to rule the night. By one word, he creates time and space itself. We know from Einstein that time and space is a function of the movement of those bodies. So this God, completely outside our experience, we can't possibly go through a wormhole and understand that God because he's outside time and space and we're inside it. But then in Genesis 2, God presents a very different image. You mentioned anthropomorphic. Here we see a God who bends down in the dust and with his own hand shapes us and breathes the spirit of life into us. Why would that unknowable God present himself in that way? Is that second way God any more or any less than in that first way? But for our understanding, these are two facets of that one God. Just your comments on any of that.
Well, I think something that's really important that, is thinking about lessons we've learned from other traditions. So I know, for instance, when I was a professor at a Christian institution training pastors, imagine that, their first Muslim hire. One of the things that really struck me was some of our more religiously conservative Christian students would gravitate to me. And who would have thought that? The assumption is if you're very theologically bound, that you wouldn't really engage with people of another religion. But what those students would tell me is they would mention, they're like, you wear hijab, the covering, and we respect that you are not afraid to announce your religion by your very dress. And so there was something about that outward living in which they could resonate with, and we talked about. And for me, one of the things I learned from evangelical Christians was talking about their journey with God. For Muslims, or for me, it was something that was very deep in my psyche and I was connected to, but it was so interesting where I would go to these conversations with evangelical pastors, and their conversation would be about their relationship with God in a very public way. So what I learned, from those, as I mentioned, Quakers, as I mentioned, other traditions, I think it's really important to think about in how many ways do we have that conversation with the divine, if we do believe in a divine. And I think we mentioned before the show, I have a book coming out. It's called Dreaming Lost Bodies Back. It's a book of poetry and theopoetics. And it's actually centered on the conversation, as you mentioned earlier, male and female. It's centered on the conversation that mothers have with God when they are faced with violence. So it comes out of experiences of mothers losing their children during the pandemic, out of working with mothers in Oakland whose children were lost to gun violence, and doing things like working with Buddhist partners on silent retreats for these mothers, then working with mothers across the globe that have lost their children. And one of the poems in the book is about my negotiation with God. So it's not just a conversation, but one of the things that happens was, as a mother of a child, my son had an accident that created a serious injury in which he was in and out of the hospital for about 4 months and was on a feeding tube. It was a very, we just kind of had to negotiate all of that. But I remember the nights in which he was in pain. He was about 12 years old, and it was just me. I was in my room in the hospital with him. And I would have, in addition to just praying, it was this notion of tawakkul, which means utter and complete reliance on God. It was in that moment where I said, and I think mothers and probably fathers and other people who are caretakers of children, you don't have to be a mother. You can also be symbolically a mother of a child who's not in your family. So many of us mother many and father and auntie and caretake for many children. And it was this conversation, God, take me, why don't you take me? And I think I'm going to be moved to tears. But if you look at wars across the country, that's a negotiation that mothers have with God. And it's a very particular and unique kind of worship of God, but it's done in a way that's like you as a mother want to protect your children. And so I think for me, that's been really a part of my journey too, around violence prevention, is seeing and understanding that very often it's women who have lost a child that are the first to cross the boundaries in war, that are the first to cross the boundaries. I've done a lot of work on gang violence. Mothers who are the first to cross the boundaries and say, let's express forgiveness and care for one another. This can't go on. So I wanted to share that because I think for me, God can be deeply personal, deeply individual, deeply a transcendent kind of form of divine being. And it can be in that conversation where, God, I want my child to live through the day, through the night. What and how do we get there? And so sometimes it's very practical, and so I was just going to share that. I think for me, that's been a really interesting part of of kind of infleshing for me, not God, because in my tradition, God is non-anthropomorphic, but for me, what is that experience of living with God in a consistent basis as we navigate the real issues of violence that never seem to go away, sadly?
Well, I'm going to reveal my ignorance here in the hope of learning something. My ignorance about the Quran. So you mentioned negotiations with God, and this is actually a tradition in the Bible. You see Moses interceding on behalf of the people. You see Abraham negotiating with God and whittling down the number of righteous people that have to be found in Sodom and Gomorrah, because he wants to protect his nephew Lot and his family and anyone else. And it starts with 50 righteous, 45. You probably know the story in the Bible. And other negotiations with God. Are there any examples like that in the Quran?
Yes.
Of people negotiating with God?
And we have the Quran, which is the holy book of Muslims, which was revealed in the language of Arabic. So for instance, I didn't grow up with Arabic. I'm a South Asian, so our primary languages would have been Kashmiri, Hindi, and Urdu. But we learn Arabic so we can learn the original text in which the Quran was revealed in. And for instance, there's a story of the nighttime ascension, Prophet Muhammad's Isra and Mi'raj, the ascension to, the story goes through this night journey to Jerusalem, and then in negotiating with God the number of prayers that Muslims should have. And there's a great conversation where he engages with Moses, with another prophet that Muslims believe in, since we believe in the prophets that are mentioned in Hebrew and Christian scriptures from all the way from Adam, and then obviously for us, Prophet Muhammad is the final prophet, and the additional belief that differentiates Islam from Judaism and Christianity. And it's so fascinating because this idea of first, it's sort of a high number, and the reality is people won't do that, so it gets whittled down because of the frailty of human beings. There's other negotiations that didn't turn out so well, that weren't as fruitful, that were based on arrogance. And that was the story of Iblis, or Satan, who declares himself better than all other creation, an arrogant kind of negotiation. And we know the result of that. And I mention those stories because I think what can happen is sometimes we think of the connection with God as so abstract, as so disconnected. We can philosophize it or theorize it or theologize it, put it into scholarship, put it into inaccessible language. We should be able to connect with God whether we're literate or not, whether we're educated or not, whether we're connected or not, and to some kind of ability to generate scholarship and engagement. And I think for me, that's been really an important part of my journey, is to think about the ways in which religion is accessible to people. Religion is a part of the ways in which people can have spiritual conversations without being afraid, because I think we're afraid to express that connection. And when we get and operate in a spiritual space out of a place of fear, it creates an inability to connect with our own traditions, our own teachings, and then it creates an inability to understand or be curious of other people. So one of the ways to manage or engage in difference is to pull away and say, no, and what's fascinating, the last thing I'll share here is that we know that prejudice against race, religion, gender, whatever prejudice may be, the World Health Organization says that's imprinted on children. Guess when? What age?
Probably by age 2.
0 to 5. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So at the time that we should be exposing our children to diversity is often the time that parents are most afraid, and they just want to keep their children disconnected and only engage with what they see as of their own perspective. So I just wanted to kind of put that there, because I feel like one of the ways in which we can begin to think about diversity isn't just that I appreciate and learn as an adult, but how do we think about differences? So honestly, by the time you're 18, it's really hard to unlearn, undo, deform. I've had friends who talk about the deformation of hatred of others. And I do think that that's one of the reasons as a country that we're in this moment is I wish we were forming and spiritually forming our children for love of the other instead of hate of another.
Yeah, it's so opening and expansive to see God in other people, because we are all created in the image of God, as the title of this show is. We're going to have to go to a quick commercial break so that this segment doesn't go too long. I'm going to pick right up and then ask the question, where are you growing next? Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Najeeba Syeed on Created in the Image of God.
In a world where religions often talk past each other, what if we just sat down and listened? Facets of One is a simple devotional, bringing together scripture from the world's faiths, centered on one truth. God is one. From the Bible to the Quran, from Krishna to Christ, each voice speaks in turn, without argument, without division. You don't have to agree on everything. Just be willing to pray, to listen, and to come together. If you're longing for something deeper than noise and division, this is a different kind of conversation. Facets of One. Many voices, one God. Will you start a circle?
Welcome back to the sadly final segment, but this isn't going to be the final segment, because I'm going to extend an invitation for Najeeba to come back, and I'm trusting that she'll be willing to, because this is just, there's so much here to unpack, so much to learn. And I have to go back to what you were just saying, because the Genesis story that we were talking about, that original so-called original sin. I'm not going to get into the theology of that. I want to use that as an example to showcase what you were saying, that sometimes we theologize everything away when God intends us to be very practical. I was thinking when you were saying that many of the conservative evangelicals were drawn to you, and you mentioned your headdress and so forth. It's partly because in the conservative evangelical movement, there's a desire to submit one's own circumstances to God and obey his commandments to the letter. Now, Jesus spoke in parables, But that doesn't mean the stories of the Old Testament are just parables. They may or may not be entirely 100% historically accurate in every detail. There may or may not have been some embellishment, but you can read them either way. And here's one example. The story of Adam and Eve. God says, because of what you've done, talking specifically to Eve now, we won't talk about the serpent or Adam in this moment in the interest of time, but he tells Eve, because of what you've done, you will have pain in childbirth. And every mother knows far more than I the pain in childbirth. When you talked about passing out, I almost passed out the first time our first child was born because it went to an emergency C-section, and I had to hold my wife's hand, reassuring her while they were cutting her open, and she was awake. And it was the most horrifying experience I've ever had in my life. So pain in childbirth, but think of this. When her firstborn son killed his younger brother, there was no greater pain.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this when you were talking about mothers negotiating their children going to war, right? The pain in childbirth is both literal and metaphorical.
So interestingly enough, the story is also in the Quran, but the story in the Quranic telling is that Adam and Eve ate the fruit together. So it wasn't one before the other. And so interestingly enough, that is one of the things that we find is these stories are told similarly and differently depending on the scripture.
And to be fair, in the book of Genesis, you could also easily read it literally as they ate it together, because it says she took the fruit and gave to her husband who was with her, and he ate also. So the sequence there is, yes, that they did it together.
We could spend time splicing the text. I think what you've mentioned is whether it's scripture, whether it's legislation. I have a background, I've been to law school. I think in general, one of the things we really have to remember is what is the intention and the spirit behind some form of law, some form of commandment. And one of the things that's been really helpful when I've talked to and engaged with Jewish scholars or other traditions is sort of this idea of that covenant, and that part of a legal tradition or a canon of law isn't just your rights, but it's your duties and your responsibilities. So I think we live in a moment, and I've written about this recently around neighborliness, where Robert Bella, a sociologist, says that we have this point of, we're in this point, he's passed away since, we're in this point of American history where individual rights have been very sacred, and we are also deeply disconnected from one another. And he points to the connection that the way that rights are protected, the way that rights are enforced and engaged is actually not just through a legal system, but through our connection to each other. And I would just point out that I think I would love to hear more of what is the religious obligation, not just for me. What do I, Najeeba, deserve as a Christian, as a Muslim, whatever my background is, or as a US citizen? And those are important. And also, what are my responsibilities to my neighbor? What are, Prophet Muhammad says in the oral tradition of the Hadith, says something to the effect of, one cannot be a believer if you know your neighbor is hungry at night. We think about all of the different traditions from the Buddhist tradition, the notion of interbeing, that even non-animate beings like nature have a connection to humans. Thinking about that, the Jain and Hindu traditions of satyagraha, of nonviolence. So I'm pointing out, kind of naming them all quickly. Obviously, they're very deep concepts. But what those types of religious, spiritual teachings is thinking less just about rights, which are so important, and the protection of rights, to thinking about the ways in which we're connected, so that I don't want to violate your rights because we have this deep connection. And just as we campaign for rights, we need to also have campaigns for what are our collective responsibilities to one another. And I will mention, one of the reasons I've emphasized neighborliness is it doesn't matter if the neighbor is Christian, Jewish, Muslim, of a different race, a different language. I show up because the neighbor needs me, because they're hungry. And I think I would say in the moment that we're living, that's what's happening in Minnesota and Minneapolis, where my university is we're just showing up for each other. And we don't ask who's at the door. We don't ask where they came from. We don't ask what their country of origin. It means showing up because, guess what? It could be you tomorrow. It could be me. We don't know. We don't know what will happen in our lives. And that's why we show up for each other, because at any moment, any of us could be in that position where we need support too.
Thank you so much. So well said. We are sadly out of time. I'm going to immediately extend that invitation to return. I was going to offer you the last word, but I think that sums up nicely where you're at. I want to just make sure everybody realizes Dreaming Lost Bodies Back. The book you spoke out may well be out. You mentioned earlier Ramadan. Well, this show is airing April 12th. It was pre-recorded, but Ramadan will be past, but the book may be out or about to go out. So Najeeba Syeed, you see her name there on the screen, Dreaming Lost Bodies Back. Go look for that book, and I will dream you back on the show by extending an invitation to come as soon as possible. My tagline is always created in the image of God, building vibrant communities, right? That part. But the tagline is you are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. We're going to go to the sneak peek, but one final word from you. What do you want to leave the audience with before we go to that sneak peek?
I think what I would leave the audience with is that right now, one of the most spiritually radical things we can do is to love our neighbor. And that seems so simple, but love is unconditional. It's inclusive. It is something that all of our traditions, and if you don't have a spiritual tradition, it's a moral tradition. So the moment that we're in is not a political moment. It is a moment for our country to decide, wherever and however and whatever you do, it's a moment to decide, is this a moral obligation for me to love my neighbor?
Wonderful. There you have it. We will go to the sneak peek now, and we will be letting you know when we have Najeeba back on the show. Thank you so much for being here. Truly an honor. I know the audience loved it as much as I did. So sneak peek next. We'll see you all next week on Created in the Image of God. Hey everyone, it's Wade Franson, and I've got John Fella in the studio here with me. As we always do, we'd like to get to know what the forces were that formed and shaped you, who your parents were, and the situation that you grew up in. So let's just jump right into it.
I like to describe my childhood and my upbringing on the north side of Chicago as kind of a SNL, Saturday Night Live skit, right? I grew up in a very stereotypical side of Chicago, blue-collar Catholic household. My father was a truck driver. My mother was a secretary most of her working life. My father gave me one piece of advice in life. Whatever happens in life, whatever you're facing, whatever's going on, stay calm, take a breath, compose yourself, don't panic.
I saw you give a presentation, I believe it was a commencement address, that was just so powerful, and I wanted to have you on the show. The title of this show, Created in the Image of God, is Building Vibrant Communities. What is it about it, without, again, getting critical, what is it about it that you didn't have community there?
My experience of Christianity prior to that was really Catholicism, right? I didn't have another experience of it. And I was very much into the new age, meditation and chakras and all that kind of stuff. And so was my wife, who was actually raised Jewish, by the way. One of the reasons we joined was to find community, and we met some nice people and nice families. The difference, though, was there are people that are showing up here, and I jokingly, even in my book, I refer to it as church for atheists, because, you can literally be an atheist and be there because it's just about some place to go and engage on some level. But here's what really hit me. At the end of the night, there was a guy, I still remember his name was Matt. And as they closed in prayer, Matt prayed for me specifically.